Well, hi there, spiritual wayfinders. Welcome to the Betwixt podcast, a waypoint for inspiring conversation and grounding practices that help us navigate the spiritual life with embodied wisdom. I'm Deb Gregory. This episode is released in partnership with InterVarsity Press. You can get 25% off my new book, Spiritual Wayfinding, with the code IVPOD25 at ivpress.com. That's IVPOD25 for 25% off and free U.S. shipping. My guest is Geoffrion. She's a theologian, a photographer, and one of the world's leading voices in Labyrinth spirituality. Her scholarship and ministry at Chartres Cathedral in France have shaped how countless pilgrims understand the Labyrinth as a path of prayer. But Jill's work extends far beyond France. Through her nonprofit Faith, Hope, and Love Global Ministries, she brings large-scale labyrinth installations and healing practices to communities around the world, especially in regions marked by violence, displacement, and collective trauma. Her life's work embodies a deep conviction that safe spaces and embodied practices can open pathways of healing, resilience, and hope. Jill, I am so happy that we're recording this as the day after Easter. And Easter is kind of a big day for Labyrinths. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But first of all, would you be willing to share an embodied practice that's meaningful to you and just your experience with that practice?
Yes. In the mornings, when I get up as close to sunrise as I can, I get outside and I go for a walk. Because I travel a lot, that means I'm in a lot of different places and that the sun is continually waking up at different times. But that practice of being out 15, 20 minutes as the sun is rising or as close to it as I can really feeds my soul. I feel where I am, I sense where I am, I smell it, I connect with it, and it helps me to connect with that deeper part of the divine that is in that place and is manifesting in whatever the day is bringing.
That sounds so grounding, especially since you travel so much. What is that sensation of different place for you?
It often has to do with the feel of the air on my skin, what smells are in the place. Also, because I'm in a lot of different latitudes, the intensity of the sun, even as it's rising, and the colors of the environment, depending on what season it is, wherever I am.
Oh, I love that sensory experience. Thank you for sharing that. Well, today we're going to talk about labyrinths, and you are
Right.
someone who knows so much about labyrinths. But would you first introduce us to what a labyrinth is? We'll start at the very basics.
Yes, a labyrinth is a pattern that has a pathway that turns back on itself at least once and reaches a center. So the important things there are that it's a pattern. First of all, it's something that you can look at, that you can understand. It has a pathway, so there's something to follow. And unlike just going out for a walk down the street, it actually turns back on itself at least once. It can turn back on itself 20 times, 100 times, or once, but it does turn back. So you're making a full 180 turn, which has a physiological effect on your body and brain. And then it reaches a center so that there's a place where you arrive in the pattern and can leave.
And what's the difference between a labyrinth and a maze? Because sometimes people use the terms interchangeably.
In French, same word represents both. So that's understandable. A maze is a place where you can get lost. It's designed to pit your mental and physical skill against the brain work of the creator. So the idea is somebody creates something and it's a puzzle. A labyrinth, if you choose to get on the path, either with your finger or your feet or your eyes, as long as you stay on that path, it will lead you to that center. So there's no choices except the choice, do I enter? Whereas in a maze, it's a continual series of choices that can confuse you, whereas the labyrinth is meant to take you to your own center as well as a physical center.
Oh, that's good. Kind of like a string, right? That's one thing I've
Exactly.
done recently where I couldn't walk a labyrinth, and I thought, "I wonder if I can unwind a ball of string in my driveway." I was like, "Oh, it's kind of the same idea."
Absolutely.
You mentioned how important it is that it turns back on itself and the physiological experience. That was one of the first things that captivated me when I walked a labyrinth. I felt the sensation of turning back
Mm.
on myself, on the path, right?
Mhm.
Why is that, something that's significant for our bodies?
There have been studies done that show that what happens when you do that physiological turn, you activate different sides of your brain. So I think that it's calling you towards a whole brain experience as opposed to one side or the other. My own experience of it is that I'm going one way and suddenly I'm going another way, but I'm still on the same path. So it's a little confusing. And then, like many paradoxes, it makes sense.
Some people find it a little bit distressing, though.
I do, sure. I remember the Chartres Labyrinth has 28 full turns, whereas the classical labyrinth, which is the other well used pattern, has 7. So there's a very different experience in terms of how many times you turn. But I love the Chartres labyrinth for many reasons. And one of them is that you have to do this practice of turning and reorienting yourself or being reoriented actually by the pattern 28 times. But it can be distressing. And I remember once walking in the Chartres Cathedral where I live 2 to 6 months a year, depending on the year. And so I get to walk the labyrinth there a lot. And there was one evening when I was walking with a group and I kept stopping at the turns. It was as if my body would not stop each time I got to a turn. And I thought, what in the world? Why is this happening? I trusted what was happening, but I also didn't understand it. And suddenly, at about the 15th turn and 15th time this happened, I had a revelation, which was my dad was in the midst of dying at that time. And what I needed to do was stop and be present. And so when I got back to my home in Minnesota, where my dad also lived, I was so much more present to him because of that experience of needing to stop before changing, because obviously we were in a big time of change together.
Wow.
But it was disorienting.
And it
So,
sounds like there was a wisdom that your body was offering you through that experience.
absolutely, the body and the pattern
Yeah,
together.
together.
Yeah, I needed both.
There's something amazing about particularly that labyrinth, the Charlotte Labyrinth. Tell us about that labyrinth, because that's kind of the most famous one, and it's one clearly you know so much about, and you lead pilgrimages there as well, don't you?
Yes, I do. The labyrinth there was put in the floor around 1220, so more than 800 years ago. It's absolutely beautiful. It's
It is
limestone with
gorgeous.
with a marble-like dividing path. Although some people think the pattern was created at Chartres, it wasn't. It was the first time we see it is around 800, so 400 years before Chartres in manuscript, and we see
Okay.
it evolving. What's beautiful and different about the Chartres labyrinth is the flower in the center. There's no other labyrinth that I'm aware of that has that flowering center with the perfect geometry that is speaking all sorts of messages. And there's two other beautiful, unique features, which are the extensions around the labyrinth. Some people call them lunations. I don't use that term because I don't think they are related to the moon. I think they're related to fortresses. If you look around the cathedral and look at other imagery, you can see they're the same type of shape around the outside of castles in the medieval period. So there's some sort of a protective and
Hmm.
enclosing feature that's not found elsewhere in the same
Oh,
way.
like
And
it's a fortress in itself. It's a protected space.
yes, exactly. I
Okay.
walked with a group of French people once, and during the debriefing, one of the men said, "This is my castle."
Yes.
So, okay, I'd never heard of that before, but in the context, it made perfect sense. And if you do look at the imagery in Chartres Cathedral and other medieval imagery, you will see all around towns these protective walls that look a lot like the extensions, which the French people call teeth. And the other beautiful feature of the Chartres Labyrinth is the first stone. And I'm not aware of any other labyrinths with that beautiful shape, which to me, as a theologian, looks like a baptismal font. But
Mm.
other people see other shape. I mean, it's a shape, so you can see many different interpretations of it.
Why is the Chartres Labyrinth so significant? Because it's a pilgrimage site, right?
It,
People
it,
have come to this church from all over. Can you talk a little bit about, pilgrimage and when you walk into the cathedral and encounter the labyrinth, how is that so significant for people?
Big question. I just finished the first draft of a 26-page article on this, so I'm going to try to put it,
Yay!
so, yeah, very
We're the first
simply.
to hear it.
That's true. The idea of pilgrimage is clearly a biblical idea. I mean, it's in every tradition, so let's start with that. It's a universal impulse to go somewhere and have an encounter with the divine. So that's basically what pilgrimage is. In the Christian tradition, it was in the Old Testament. There were 5 holidays where all males were required to go to Jerusalem as pilgrimage. When you get to the New Testament, our lives are redefined as pilgrimage, as moving towards God. And Chartres particularly has been a place of pilgrimage because of the veil of Mary, piece of cloth that some believe was worn by Mary either at the Annunciation or during the birth of Christ. And for those in the Catholic tradition or in the Eastern traditions, that particular piece of cloth has significance and has drawn pilgrims for centuries. I don't believe that the labyrinth was actually created as a pilgrimage tool as much
Okay.
as, of course, in the medieval period, everything had many, many different layers of meaning. It was really created as a liturgical tool for the community. And modern people, with our more individualistic perspective, we use it much more on an individual level, but I think first of all it was used, and the documents that we have indicate that it was used by the community first.
Yes, and that is kind of a misconception. You have a lot of stories about the labyrinth that people walked it first and primarily as a pilgrimage tool for those who couldn't go to Jerusalem.
No, no, that's a fallacy.
It is a fallacy. This is a myth that we've developed because we enjoy that idea, right?
It's exactly true. And the first time we even hear of such an idea was maybe in the 18th century and the 19th century. This is
Okay.
not a medieval practice. So we have no indication that pilgrims used the labyrinth instead of going to Jerusalem in the medieval period. So we've got to get rid of that. Not that we couldn't use it in that way or that it wasn't in the 18th and 19th century, but we really need to look at labyrinths from a historical point of view, period by period, and understand that just because we practice something in the labyrinth now, which is meaningful and has a history, that doesn't mean that that is the only history that it has. So we need to
Yes.
have a multi faceted understanding historically of the labyrinth.
That's so good. And really, this is what has been so compelling for me is learning the communal and liturgical practices around the labyrinth, particularly for the Christians in Europe and North Africa as well. Tell us about the liturgical practice of the labyrinth.
Okay, well, we know starting in the 14th century for sure, that's the documentation. 1396 is the first document. I mean, it talks about Easter Monday service, but there are other
Oh,
documents that talk about Easter evening services, which would start with the clergy coming out of the choir down the nave, circling the nave, and throwing or kicking a great big yellow ball called the pelota back and forth, very joyously celebrating the resurrection of Christ while singing a very common medieval hymn, which was a praise of the resurrection of Christ, including Mary Magdalene's words in that song.
I almost imagine it like a hacky sack.
A lot bigger. It was bigger. You couldn't be held in one hand, the documentation
Really?
says. Had to be held in 2 hands. Yeah.
Okay. And they played with the ball
Yes.
in the labyrinth. So many of us want to be very somber and quiet when we walk a labyrinth, but you can play with it.
Absolutely. And you can embody your joy. Of course, Easter doesn't just fall out of the sky. There's in the liturgical calendar, there's 40 days of Lent of especially in the medieval period where people were eating less. They were, if you've ever gone through a whole liturgical season with all of the
Fasting and
sad, difficult,
yes.
and I mean, sometimes in Chartres, when I go every night, we sing all about forgiveness and our sin. And by the time you get to Easter, believe me, I would be dancing and kicking a ball too. It
Yes.
makes sense from a bodily point of view where there's such a release, such a joy that Christ is risen. And this is what they were celebrating.
One other thing that's kind of compelled me with that story is how much script is part of the Lenten season leading up to Easter. And yet, when they're out there with this ball and singing and dancing, that's much more of an interactive kind of way of being together and celebrating that's less scripted. And what a relief that must have also been.
But I think at the same time, it was scripted because there was a certain dance step that was used and there
Okay.
was a certain script. Well, let me just read you Christians, raise your song of praise to Christ, the Paschal Lamb. The Lamb redeemed the sheep. Sinless Christ has brought sinners back to the Father. And then I'll skip a stanza. Tell us, Mary, what did you see upon the way? I saw the tomb of the living Christ. I saw the glory of his rising. I saw the angels bearing witness, the burial clothes folded. Christ, my hope is risen. He goes before him, his own, into Galilee. So and it goes on. It was actually scripted. They were singing this
Okay.
over and over, but they were singing their joy and singing their faith
In a labyrinth.
in a
Yeah.
labyrinth while kicking a yellow ball back and forth. And there was the senior priest was the one in the middle, and all the rest were moving around the outside.
That's quite a visual. Have you reenacted this at all or seen people try to reenact this to see what it would actually look like?
Yes, starting in around 2010, there was a man who worked for the cathedral in Chartres who actually had this reenacted by members of the Chemin Neuf community who pray there. They're young people studying theology in Paris, and they live in Chartres and do some of the liturgy there in the evenings, especially and at Easter time. And he had them reenact this. And then it was adapted into an Easter evening liturgy led by the bishop for many years until COVID. And also there was a change of bishops. But I've heard, I'm usually in Chartres at Easter. I wasn't there yesterday, and a friend sent a picture, and they did have a labyrinth walk on the labyrinth last night as part of the evening liturgy. And they had the rector of the cathedral holding the Paschal candle, and it's a big, big, big candle,
Yes.
and tall, at least 3 foot tall. And he used that and led the procession of all the parishioners through the labyrinth one way and to the center and then out towards the altar last night. So it goes on, a different ritual, but
Right.
again, part of the church's liturgy, celebrating the light of Christ using the labyrinth.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
beautiful. Let's pause here and follow a thread, one that stretches from ancient Greek mythology through early Christian imagination and into the playful Easter dances of the Middle Ages. In the Greek myth, Theseus enters a twisting labyrinth to face the Minotaur, a beast who devours vulnerable humans. Ariadne slips a golden ball of thread into the hands of Theseus, and it becomes a lifeline that he unwinds behind him as he travels through the labyrinth. After defeating the beast, Theseus gathers the trapped souls and he leads them to freedom by following that thread back out of the labyrinth. Early Christians looked at this familiar story and saw a pattern that resonated with their hope. The true hero wasn't Theseus. The true hero was Christ, the victor, the one who conquered the devil, descended into the dark places, and who continues to lead humanity out into resurrection light. By the Middle Ages, French clergy danced this story with that big yellow ball, tossing and kicking it back and forth as they sang Easter songs. And their Easter labyrinth dance, it wasn't a break from the sacred. It was a liturgy of play that restored their energy, that loosened their collars, and let them step fully into the joy of the resurrection story. Restorative play, as University of Notre Dame researcher Matt Bloom notes, is essential for sustaining meaningful work because it interrupts the stress cycles. It restores our attention and it protects us from burnout. Play gives the mind and body space to reset, renewing the flexibility, imagination, and emotional buoyancy that we need to keep showing up with integrity and joy. The golden thread still winds through our lives, inviting us to unwind what's held too tightly, to trust the path beneath our feet, and to join the divine dance with the spirit of holy play. You're unfolding to us that it's a sacred tool, it's a liturgical tool that can be used in different ways and in different times, depending on what people are wanting to express in their worship, right? What's in their hearts,
Absolutely.
what's in their community.
And there's a more modern, contemporary, I would call it, a contemporary practice of using the labyrinth during Lent, during and Easter season for personal contemplation, meditation, and reflection. So it can be both. I think the medieval theologians who created the labyrinth would be happy to know that we're using it in multiple ways, which is what they did probably.
Yes. And kind of going back to the medieval expressions of the labyrinth. I mean, there were some that were on the floor in a cathedral, but some were in manuscripts, some were on doorways. Talk about where do we find them in the Christian tradition?
The first labyrinth that we can date is a Roman mosaic, so pre-Christian, that was repurposed. It's in northern Africa, and it has in the center it's a little tiles mosaic, and it was placed by the doorway of the cathedral there in 324. And we know anything that shows up in a cathedral has been around because it doesn't get to the cathedral first. There's an older tradition. But in 324, they repurposed this mosaic. If you travel where the Rome held influence, you'll find these mosaics on the floor, often by doorways as protective features of a building. Now it's outside, and in the center, it has a word play, Sancta Ecclesia, the Holy Church. So that's the first.
Okay, there's play again.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely.
So a word play that was at the center of the labyrinth. Yeah.
Yes, and then we start seeing them in manuscripts around 800 or so. Patterns get developed, and then in the 1100s we see them being placed in smaller scale in Italian churches, either on the floor. There's one by the door in Lucca. Then from there, the next century in France, they're placed on the floor in 42 feet across in Chartres, large
Yes.
walkable labyrinths. So there's a long
Large.
history.
That is a long and varied history. There was also a time where they were ripped out of the floors of some of the cathedrals, right? And there was some skepticism about it. Some people say it's because of maybe earlier traditions connecting to like the Greek myths of Theseus and the Minotaurs associated with the labyrinth, or because it was disruptive when people were
Yes.
playing in the labyrinth during the service. Why has there been skepticism about the labyrinths and Christianity in particular? Because that still comes up today.
Yes, I think starting with the Enlightenment, traditions got forgotten. So this liturgical tradition got forgotten. I think that the whole myth of Theseus and the Minotaur was actually accepted in the Christian tradition because they repurposed it to represent Theseus representing Christ and the Minotaur representing the devil. And Theseus' killing of the Minotaur was Christ overcoming death. And so that
Oh, the Easter
actually
story.
It is the Easter story,
Yes.
and that's the whole
Mm.
idea why it was placed, particularly in these manuscripts. Many
Okay.
manuscripts have Theseus and the Minotaur in the center, but also in some of the Italian church labyrinths, it's there. By the Enlightenment, by the 18th, 19th century, they had forgotten this earlier tradition of incorporating it around Easter or other traditions. And they were annoyed by people making noise during the Mass. And it was actually the clergy that wanted and did remove some of the labyrinths from the French cathedrals because they didn't want to be interrupted.
That's too bad. Today, the labyrinth is quite popular,
Mhm.
partly from Lauren Artress, who has helped revive the use of a labyrinth more for spiritual and self discovery and healing experiences for people. You also have used the labyrinth in ways that facilitate spiritual depth and healing. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like for you?
Sure, I'd love to. It's been my privilege, really, starting in 2007, to install labyrinths in places of suffering. My husband and I started a nonprofit called Faith, Hope, and Love Global Ministries in 2007, and working in places of suffering and war around the world. So the first labyrinth that we installed was in the city of Goma, Democratic Republic of Congo. And if you look that up, you will see it's still a war zone. And I went with an open mind. I just went willing to see if the labyrinth was a tool that would work cross culturally. I knew it worked in Western environments. I'd worked with it in US and in Europe, but I hadn't worked with it in Africa. And I worked with our partners there and they were willing to give it a try. So I always create temporary labyrinths wherever I go and teach people how to build them so that if they find it a meaningful practice, they create their own long-term labyrinths. And it's happened in many places. But
Hmm.
that particular labyrinth I put next to the hospital for women who had been raped. And we were working
Oh,
with ministers in this city, this war torn city of violence that had just experienced the eruption of a volcano a few years before that. So there were pieces of lava everywhere. And what we did was we put down plastic tape and created a large scale chart labyrinth, which was used by the ministers. And because it was my first, I was ignorant enough not to also go into the hospital and teach the women how to use the labyrinth, which I still regret to this day. But of course, the women, after the seminar was over and all the pastors went home, the women came out and used the labyrinth. And so I got to talk to some of them and they found it very meaningful. And eventually, local people put lava rocks over all the tapes and it became a permanent. I don't think it's still there, but for a while it was there. What we discovered was it gave people in crisis, huge crisis, a moment to center themselves, to be with God. These were people of faith, Christian leaders, to be with God. And their lives are so bombarded with trauma, their own trauma and their community trauma, that they never had a safe space in which to process any of it. And the labyrinth served as that safe space. So
mm,
people told us that they had experienced really profound revelations and physical healings, which I,
mm.
wasn't something I was looking for, but it certainly comes up regularly in these environments. Then when we were working in Rwanda, when we were working in Ukraine, when we were working in Myanmar, Burma, Cambodia, we kept installing labyrinths and have just seen over the years since 2007, so it's been 20 years now, how much the labyrinth provides a safe space for people to open to transformation and to God's love too, just to
To
God's love.
God's love.
Yeah.
That's
So
so remarkable.
most recently, I was just on the border of Thailand and Myanmar, where there's a civil war right now on the Myanmar side, and I've worked with some women there over the last few years, and I just put a very simple taped 3-circuit labyrinth on the floor, and we walked together. There were about 25 of us in a 3-circuit labyrinth, so we couldn't all fit in the center. We had to we had 3 circles around the center. Some people never even got to the center, and we sang, and those middle circles moved as we could, and afterwards, we just asked what happened. And there was physical healing, there was emotional healing, there was spiritual reflection about what had happened since the last time we walked the labyrinth, which was a year ago. They remembered walking this labyrinth and praying the labyrinth. These are women who have no access to health care. There was a lot of talk that morning about physical abuse and, hard lives. They spend their days under the very hot Southeast Asian sun farming. They don't know if they're going to have enough food for their family every day. And yet, here in the labyrinth, they had a moment of physical and spiritual healing. It was such a privilege to be there with them and for them to share that with me.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
Mm.
Yeah, that's not something that you hear much of, people going to serve those in places of crisis to give them a labyrinth as a tool.
Well, let me reframe that.
Yeah.
We all work in places of suffering. And
Yes.
I'm very spatially challenged. So if I can put a labyrinth down or get people to help me, I always pray before I have a labyrinth installation, God, send someone to help me who's got a mathematical mind. And there's always someone who comes to help. So, for instance, with last year, one of my students from 2012, who is now a refugee in that area, was there. And I got a little confused. It was just a small labyrinth, but I got confused. And he's like, okay, Dr. Jill, here's how we do it. There's always someone. So anyone can create a labyrinth, and we all work with people who are suffering, including ourselves. Every person suffers. So for those who are listening, you too can do this. You don't have to do it over in Thailand. You can do it in your neighborhood, on your driveway, and invite
Yes.
someone who's suffering to walk with you.
Yes. You talked about the healing. As a spiritual director, I've guided people in labyrinth walks, and you don't set it up. You don't give them a script necessarily of what will happen to them. It ends up being a surprise very often. And each person's experience is so sacred and so beautiful. But I
Mm.
never really thought about the physical healing. And in 2022, I went to do the Labyrinth facilitation training at Chartres with Lauren Artris
Oh,
and the Veritas group, but 6 months before I broke my ankle.
mm,
And the doctor was like, "Oh, you'll be fine in 6 months, no worries." Well, I still couldn't walk without pain.
mm,
And we got to Paris, had my husband and kids with me, and we were gonna spend a couple days in Paris, and it was so painful to navigate
mm,
Paris when you have a mobility challenge, and
mm.
so I thought, "How am I gonna do this?" And then we got down to Chartres, and such a beautiful town, but also very pedestrian. So I realized, oh, I have to walk all the way into the church from where we were staying. And it was just so painful. But the night we arrived, they had the labyrinth open for us to walk. And my first pain free steps were in the labyrinth.
Wow.
Yeah. And it never really connected to me that that was like a healing experience until quite some time later. I just thought, oh, wow, hey, I took my shoes off and I felt the cold stone and, walked slowly. And I thought, oh my goodness, my ankle doesn't hurt. And
Mm,
that became the beginning of a physical progress that I needed to make. But looking
mm.
back on that experience now, I can recognize and see that, that's part of my own healing story. So I don't discount that anymore. I leave that open as a possibility of what might happen to someone. Say more about why do you think it is that people have profound spiritual, emotional, or even physical healing experiences in a labyrinth, especially when it's connected to prayer, right?
Right. I'll just start by saying it's a mystery and how lucky we
Yes.
are to be able to live with mystery. Having said that, I believe that the theologians who created the Chartres labyrinth pattern put into it dimensions and ratios that resonate with our physical body. They are similar to what's in our body. And I think our body recognizes that when we're on this pattern, um, and that it responds, that it's an alignment. That's on a very um, mathematical, physical level. Also, it's a safe space, and a lot of people don't feel safe a lot of the time for a lot of reasons. And once you're in a safe space, healing is possible in a way that it's not possible when you're not in a safe space. So I think that that's
Hmm.
part of it as well. And then taking 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 10 minutes to be quiet, to not talk with anyone else, although sometimes you can talk. I've done talking labyrinth walks, but mostly contemporary practice is silent, and taking that time to connect deeply with God, the divine, it's healing. That's healing. And if we only can bring these practices into our lives on the labyrinth and elsewhere, I think we would experience far more healing than we do without those practices. And
Yeah.
finally, I'll just say it is a mystery, and how beautiful that we get to be part of a beautiful mystery.
Yeah, it is beautiful. How do people go about walking a labyrinth and connecting it to their prayer? Is there some tips you can offer? How do we encounter God in a labyrinth? Because some people feel very comfortable with that, and other people may feel a little apprehensive about that.
Sure. And I think that a very wise labyrinth mentor that I had said, Jill, if you watch, some people will move towards a labyrinth and then they move away from it. And always respect that, because maybe they're not ready for some sort of change. Because I think the labyrinth invites us to change. It invites us to a deeper spiritual connection, which is going to be life changing. I respect that not everyone wants to or might feel comfortable walking a labyrinth. And I also think it's really important that we all know there is no one way to walk the labyrinth. So if you are walking the labyrinth and it becomes overwhelming for you, just walk off. It's not,
Yeah.
most labyrinths don't have physical walls in them.
Right.
And so it's an option to walk off. So we have a lot of freedom, but here's a couple tips. The first tip is, before you enter the labyrinths, I really encourage you, and I encourage myself. So this is my own practice. Stop. Stop at the entrance. Notice that you're at a threshold, that you are on the outside of something and you're about to go to the inside of something. And at that threshold, or at that transitional place, decide something. I'm going to ask a question today while I pray. I'm going to ask God to reveal something to me. I'm going to be open to whatever comes. I'm going to pray for this person that is on my heart the whole time, or I'm going to pray for myself. It doesn't matter what intention or direction you take your labyrinth walk, but it matters that you know where you're going on that
Okay.
first step. I mean,
So
then you
set
can
an intention going in.
set an intention going
Yeah.
in. And my second big tip is, don't hurry away from the center. We all do it. I do it every day. Every day I tell myself, you don't have to be done right now. In the center, after moving, 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 suddenly you're still. Take a minute, take an extra minute, take 2 extra minutes to receive what is there in the stillness. It's very countercultural, and
Mm,
for me it's a challenge, so I assume it's a challenge for other people, but
yeah. I mean,
don't hur
receiving itself is a challenge sometimes.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly. So take longer than you want in the center. You linger a little bit. And
Mm,
then thirdly, I would say, before you walk off the labyrinth, stop. Stop at the threshold again on the inside and acknowledge whatever's happened. And I always ask myself this question: what do I want to take with me? Because I can walk off the labyrinth every morning and just keep going to my day and forget about what I received or what I experienced. And so I try to say, what am I taking with me? And then have a moment of gratitude and thanks to God before I walk off, and then go on. And as you said, I guess my fourth tip is, labyrinth walks don't finish when you cross the threshold. They stay with us. Be open to more revealing itself afterwards.
'cause really it reveals to us our life, right?
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a mirror of what's inside of us. We polish the mirror so that we can actually see.
That's so beautiful. And I hope our listeners will give it a try. Now, what happens if someone is at a place where they don't have a labyrinth, that they don't have access to one to walk?
I would Google or ChatGPT, give me a paper copy of a labyrinth pattern or several patterns. And there's many on the internet. The labyrinthsociety.org has a site. This is how I started my own labyrinth journey. I was doing an interview with an artist, and she said, "And of course, you know about the labyrinth." And I said, "Of course, I never heard of the thing. Send me an article." That being a scholar, you want an article. And at the top of the article she sent, there was a labyrinth. It was this big.
Like a
Being
quarter
dyslexic,
size.
yeah,
Yeah.
like a quarter. And I looked at it. It made no sense. I'm dyslexic. It truly made no sense. So I took it to a copier and I just made it bigger until I could put my finger through it. And putting my finger through that pattern, I felt at that time, and I still can remember this physical sensation of feeling like the labyrinth was telling my life story back to me. And that's how my labyrinth
Wow.
journey started. So if you
That's
don't have a
amazing.
labyrinth near you, but you can also Google labyrinthlocator.org and find out if there is a labyrinth because you might be surprised. They're very,
Yes, they're
I
common.
think they're in 65 countries and,
Yeah, I always
you
look
know,
when I travel, and then it's, I get to tick
yeah,
off another one from another country if there is one. Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. You mentioned, dyslexia, and I'm also curious about the experience of people who are neurodivergent and the sensory experience in the labyrinth. I noticed that with children, there's a lot of resonance. I mean, it's just so natural for kids to see a labyrinth and they know exactly what to do, however they're gonna do it. Is there anything you wanna share about that?
Yes, some wise school teacher taught me once that with children on the labyrinth, and I would say this is true for neurodivergent people and probably for all of us, the first time they experience a labyrinth, let them do it however they want. Run. Especially with this was in an elementary school environment. Okay, now we're all going to run through the labyrinth, and then now invite them to walk slowly. And it's happened so many times. The second time in, there's a calmness and it's a completely different experience. And I would say for all of us, that first walk can be whatever we need it to be, however we're wired. But don't just do one labyrinth walk, do a second. And with the women, migrants, workers up in Popra, we had one walk, we debriefed it, and then we went and had a second walk and debriefed it. And of course, it's deeper the second time, just like
Yes.
any practice. You know, try different things. Don't look for
Yes.
the right way to do a
That's
labyrinth.
right.
Look for, how would this serve me today? It's a tool. How can this bring me closer to God today? Do I need to run? Do I need to walk? Do I need to just go stand in the center? Do I need to leave the center and come
Dance.
back later? Do I need to
Yeah.
dance? Yeah. Do I need
Yes.
what do I need to do?
So my family is a neurodivergent family, and I thought a lot about just the different systems of the body, the sensory systems, particularly the vestibular system is
Mm,
absolutely activated in a labyrinth. And so can the proprioception system, depending on how you're moving the
mhm,
joints, but your sense of space is totally engaged. And so I've noticed that with a lot of people who do have some sensory processing differences, that a labyrinth can be such a wonderful tool for regulating the sensory system or engaging the sensory system in a way that really opens them
mhm.
emotionally and spiritually.
Yeah, and I think, going back to a paper labyrinth, um, in one of the things that I recommend, sometimes I'm places where I can't put a labyrinth down, and you can't imagine the incredible experiences that people have using a paper labyrinth, or maybe you can. I hope you can. But
Yes.
one of one of the things I say is when you get to the center, just put your whole hand over the center as opposed to just your finger, and again, the sensory experience of the whole hand on the pattern
Ooh,
can be very helpful.
yeah.
Also, using different fingers to go through the labyrinth.
Yes, switching hands, right?
We have our whole bodies,
Yes.
and however we access those bodies and those bodies access our deeper selves. Try it and share how that happens and how it's useful so that other people can benefit from that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so
Mm.
much for sharing all that wisdom.
You're welcome. You can see I love talking about the labyrinth. I love walking it.
As we close this episode, I want to revisit the wisdom that Jill shared for walking a labyrinth as a pathway for deeper connection and healing. You can find a labyrinth by using labyrinthlocator.com to see if there's a labyrinth nearby. You can also look for a labyrinth pattern on the internet. You can trace it with your finger, with your eye, and you could even unravel a ball of string or yarn in your house or your driveway. However you choose to walk a labyrinth, simply embrace the journey, allow God to walk with you with an open heart and an open mind. So here are the 3 tips that Jill offered. First of all, before you step onto the path, remember to set your intention. Pause at the threshold and name what is it that you seek. Perhaps it's guidance or healing or gratitude. Perhaps you are in search of clarity or something that's still forming beneath the surface. Second, remember to linger at the center. Resist the urge to rush back out, and instead let the center become a place of receiving, a place to remember that you are seen, held, and cared for. And finally, before stepping back out into everyday life, take a moment at that threshold to offer gratitude for the journey and consider what is it that you would like to carry with you. Perhaps it's an insight, a feeling, a shift in perspective that you can now integrate into your daily life. The labyrinth is a tool for reflection. It meets us exactly as we are. It mirrors our inner life. And with each turn, it offers the possibility of transformation. Buen camino. Enjoy your walk. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Betwixt podcast. It has been a real pleasure to produce this podcast for you. Catch you next time.